What's the deal with Leviticus? This article will contain lots of detail. So if you have trouble following along with the audio, I encourage you to head to our website and have a look at the blog page and read it for yourself. If you've been following a read the Bible in a year type plan, it's pretty likely that you've covered Leviticus by now. But what's the deal with Leviticus? It's so strange. Leviticus is an often overlooked portion of the Bible, even while it remains an integral part of the literary flow of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. It's an integral part of the Torah, the law delivered to Israel, and an integral part of the salvation history that leads us to Jesus, the Christ. Leviticus appears dry in comparison to the exciting narratives of deliverance and war that surround it. However, it remains deeply rich in its significance to the ancient people of Israel and by extension to Christians. Let me tell you how Leviticus fits in the Bible. It's an integral part of the literary flow of the Pentateuch. The Latin name Leviticus is derived from a Greek counterpart, and it implies that this book is associated with the Levites. This is kind of misleading, because the Levites themselves are mentioned only once. However, the book does deal in large part with the priests of Israel who were from the tribe of Levi, and so it makes sense how we got the name. The later Jewish name draws a similar link, calling the book Instructions of the Priests. This makes sense given it was primarily instructions for the conduct of the priests themselves or for them to communicate to the people of Israel. The best name for capturing the importance of the place of Leviticus in the Pentateuch is the traditional Hebrew name, derived simply from the first few words of the book. I'm going to butcher this. Waikira, or which the English transliteration is, and he called. These opening words immediately promote a question. What does this follow on from? Who is he calling? The opening of Leviticus seems to simply be a continuation of a previous account that needs no explanation. Even as one reads further on into the text, it is assumed the reader or hearer is familiar with the context. It is possible that the Pentateuch was originally one continuous work that was divided into 5 volumes for convenience. This is quite evident in the awkward opening and closing of Leviticus that joins neatly with the end of Exodus and the start of Numbers. While Leviticus does address themes somewhat differently to the style of its neighbouring books, it makes best sense when it is viewed as a middle portion of one work, the Book of Moses. We could look at the Pentateuch in the following way, with a prologue, which is Genesis, how Israel became a nation. Then there's part 1, which Exodus chapters 1 to 19, how God rescued Israel. Then there's a part 2, which goes from Exodus 20 all the way through to Numbers chapter 10, verse 10, and that explains how to live with God in the promised land. Then there's part 3, Numbers chapter 10, verse 11 through to verse 36, or maybe that's chapter 36. Preparations to enter the promised land. And then an epilogue, which is Deuteronomy, a summary and exhortations prior to entry into the promised land. This breakdown is simplistic, but it does package the teaching portions of the Pentateuch into a centralized section surrounded by the stories leading up to and away from Sinai where the law was delivered. This breakdown also places Leviticus as a large portion in the middle, where, it could be argued, it takes central prominence in the whole. Regardless of prominence, seeing Leviticus in this light makes sense of the lack of introduction or conclusion and the way that it relates to Exodus and Numbers as if they were a continuation of one another. One of the key elements in demonstrating the continuity is the ongoing and repeated phrase, which is, "And the Lord spoke to Moses." This phrase, or some variant of it, occurs over 200 times in the Pentateuch and is naturally followed by instructions received from God for the people of Israel. The vast majority of Leviticus sits in portions under one of these phrases, just like large parts of Exodus and Numbers. How is Leviticus structured? It can be hard in the midst of all the laws and rules and instructions to get your head around the way that the book as a whole fits together. Let's look at an overview to see how it fits with what comes before and after. Let me rephrase that. Let's look at the structure of the whole and how it fits with what becomes before and after. The content of Leviticus naturally flows from the closing chapters of Exodus. The book ends with the erection of the tabernacle by Moses and the filling of the tabernacle by the glory of the Lord, which is in Exodus 40. The opening of Leviticus answers the next natural question for Israel. Now that God lives with us, how should we live with him? And Moses gives extended instructions on what offerings to bring and how to bring them, Leviticus chapter 1 to 7. After this, a section records the consecration of Aaron and his sons as priests who are now able to carry out those aforementioned sacrifices and their duties at the newly erected tabernacle. That's in Leviticus 8 to 10. Now, the direction of the text changes somewhat from primarily addressing the priestly function to addressing ritual cleanliness laws for people in general, Leviticus 11 to 15. Note the literary progression has gone from the central tabernacle, God's residence, to the functions in the tabernacle court, outward to the people who live around the tabernacle. The progression continues with rules about who is able to live closer and who must live outside the camp, and then another sacrificial rite is outlined, which is the Day of Atonement in Leviticus 16. Now at first, this ritual might seem out of character with the progression of the text from center outwards, but what becomes clear is that the outward movement is still active. This sacrifice continues to deal with cleanliness and sin, but here is a ritual whereby sins are carried away from the people of Israel out into the wilderness. And this marks a point where the text now turns to deal with the holiness of the lifestyle, see Leviticus 18 to 22, after a short side note about sacrificial matters in Leviticus 17. This holiness of life theme overshadows the remainder of the book, with the ordination of holy feasts, notes concerning blasphemy, Sabbaths, and redemption in Leviticus 23 to 25, as well as blessings and curses related to the holiness of people, see Leviticus 26. The book closes out with instructions on vows and gifts for God, Leviticus 27, which subtly reminds people of the expectation that they should be living in thankfulness towards God and willingly offering tithes and gifts. The final words in the book are a little summary statement. See Leviticus 27 to 34. See Leviticus 27 verse 34. It restates the claims of the text that the content was from God through Moses to the people while they were at Mount Sinai. This statement provides a natural break in the literary flow where the topic changes. It moves from the instruction of religious practices and lifestyle onto more practical matters of counting, arranging, and assigning responsibilities to the people of Israel. And that kicks off in Numbers chapter 1 through to Numbers 10, verse 10. This theme change is notable as there has been an extended attention since the arrival of Israel at Sinai on matters of morality, ethics, religious cultus, and lifestyle, whereas now the Numbers texts begin to address the need for getting Israel on the move to the Promised Land. What has not changed in the flow of the text is the model of delivery. The template is always, the Lord spoke to Moses, followed by instructions. Leviticus is an integral part of Torah for Israel. Leviticus is in the Bible due to its necessity as part of the Torah. This Torah, the law or instruction, is formed as a kind of constitution of Israel. It's their national identity, and it was tied up in the promises of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But the Torah is that body of instruction that ties Israel to Yahweh in the fulfillment of those promises and in their manner of life in response to the blessing. It ties them together with God in covenant. While the Pentateuch as a whole is the Torah of Israel, the didactic nature of those central portions from Exodus 20 all the way through to Numbers 10 verse 10, it causes Leviticus to take a central role in guiding the way of life for the Israelite in the wilderness and in the promised land, Canaan. Leviticus, in this sense, shows how the covenant people, having been rescued and given a place of worship, now need to instruction on the proper worship and relationships. The burning question at the foot of Mount Sinai is, how can we live in proximity to God? And this is exemplified in Exodus chapter 20, verse 18 to 21, where the people cannot bear to hear, let alone come near, God's earthly presence. Leviticus then promotes a culture of purity and holiness that must be maintained so that God may not depart for them or strike them down. Have a look at Leviticus 26. It shows it shows what it takes for the people to live in the presence of a holy God. Using many and varied imageries, God instructs Israel that he is qualitatively different from them, and that even by virtue of the fact that they are human, they are separate from him. Have a look at Leviticus 12 to 15. He also teaches them that God is life and that death may not be associated with him. For example, Leviticus 21. That God is whole and perfect. Have a look at Leviticus 12 to 15 and 22. He's not like other gods. See Leviticus 18. And he can only accept those who are holy like himself, and that he does not tolerate divided loyalties. For instance, in Leviticus 19, 1 to 4, 22 verses 22 to 26. Amongst other things, he doesn't accept divided loyalties amongst other things that he doesn't accept. All of these ideas fit with the overriding theme of being able to dwell in the promised land and in the presence of a holy God. Leviticus is an integral part of salvation history. The book of Leviticus is a powerful apologist of the need for a messianic figure to repair the decimated relationship between God and man. The Pentateuch opens with the beautiful picture of God walking and talking with man in a good land. See Genesis 1 and 2. But by the time we get to Leviticus, mankind needs to obey hundreds of laws in order for God to even tolerate their presence. They constantly need to repair their relationship with blood atonement. The separation is so clear in Leviticus, and the laws illustrate the means by which such a separation can be remedied. However, one wonders, how long can such a system be maintained? Is there a better way to reconcile man to God? This creates a desire for a better system that could deal with all sin and do it comprehensively. This is ultimately answered by Christ, who comes to make a once-for-all Day of Atonement sacrifice that removes the sin of his people forever by his own blood. He also comes as a greater and better high priest who can purify his people, leading them unblemished into the very presence of God. Leviticus shows us the holiness of God and leaves us hungering for a better way to be reconciled to God, something that only Jesus can do. In conclusion, Leviticus is an integral part of the literary flow of the Pentateuch, an integral part of the Torah delivered to Israel, an integral part of the salvation history that leads to Jesus the Christ. The redeemed people at the foot of Sinai needed and received instruction on how to live in the presence of a holy God, and Leviticus primarily expounds how that is achieved by ritual purity. The Lexham Bible Dictionary sums up well the message of Leviticus and its importance to salvation history. It says, quote, God's redemptive act requires that his redeemed people act redeemed. Many years later, the ultimate sacrifice of God's Son would not diminish these characteristics, but bring the holiness of God, the sinfulness of man, and God's willingness to intentionally attach himself to man into sharper focus.